Myanmar's military leadership is under regional pressure. At a special summit, Southeast Asian leaders call for an end to the post-coup violence. But beyond words, what can ASEAN offer to defuse the country's crisis? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Peter Dobby. It's been nearly 3 months since a military coup plunged Myanmar into a state of chaos, with street battles breaking out between protesters and security forces every day. But in what seems a significant breakthrough, the junta's leader has accepted a proposal to stop the violence against civilians. It came after Southeast Asian leaders met General Min Aung Hlaing during emergency talks in Jakarta with Malaysia's Prime Minister, describing it as a success that went beyond expectations. The meeting held by the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, was the first coordinated international effort to ease the crisis in Myanmar. Hundreds of unarmed protesters have been killed by the security forces since the army seized power from the democratically elected government. Singapore's Prime Minister says the junta leader did not oppose having an ASEAN delegation visit Myanmar, while members of the bloc agreed on a proposal to defuse the conflict. It includes starting a dialogue, allowing aid into the country, releasing political prisoners, and appointing a special ASEAN envoy to Myanmar. Outside the summit venue, protesters denounced the presence of the general. They said inviting him to the summit legitimised the coup, and they condemned the months of violence security forces have carried out in Myanmar against unarmed demonstrators. At least 700 people have been killed since February, though human rights activists say the actual death toll is likely to be much higher. Protesters across Myanmar also took to the streets on Saturday, despite the military's intensifying of the crackdown on rallies against the coup. Hundreds marched through cities of Mandalay, Yangon and Dawai. We'll bring in our guest shortly. First, this update from Tony Cheng with more on what was discussed at the emergency talks.
It went on longer than expected. They were supposed to be in their private meeting for 2 hours. They went on for 3. When they came out, we heard strong messages from the Malaysian Prime Minister, who said that the killings and the violence that they'd seen since the coup must end. President Jokowi of Indonesia said that developments since the coup were unacceptable. And we understand now that ASEAN has found consensus on an agreed statement with 5 points. The first is to end violence. The second is that dialogue must start between those parties involved in the violence, that humanitarian assistance will be delivered by ASEAN, that a special envoy will go, and they've been talking about this for the last couple of days. We understand that special envoy will go and act as a mediator between the protesters and the military. And finally, that all political prisoners will be released, and presumably that it will include senior leaders from the NLD like Aung San Suu Kyi and the President Win Myint. We understand from Singapore's Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong that Myanmar's senior General Min Aung Hlaing was involved in the discussions, was receptive to these suggestions and did agree to some of them. What is going to happen on the ground when he returns home is another thing, however.
OK, let's get going. Let's bring you our guests all on Skype today. In Washington, D.C., we have Amitav Acharya, specialist on Southeast Asia and ASEAN. Also, he is a distinguished professor at the School of International Service at the American University of Washington, D.C. In Thailand, we have Phil Robertson, Deputy Director of Human Rights Watch's Asia Division. And in Jakarta, we have Evan Laxmana, researcher at Indonesia's Center for Strategic and International Studies. That's a think tank with close ties to the government. Welcome to you all. Evan, can I come to you first? They've come up with 5 bullet points. What's your reading of what we think they're doing?
I think it shows that we have the beginning of a foundation to work for the next steps. This is not the end all. We still have a lot of work to do to actually implement those commitments as stated in the 5 bullet points. But compared to the skepticism over the past week that the group will fail to deliver anything, that there will not be any consensus, I think skeptics are wrong. But of course, at this point, we have the commitment. Now it's our job to figure out how to effectively implement that commitment.
Phil Robertson in Bangkok, does this mean that we might see Aung San Suu Kyi in the public eye? It's been several months now.
Well, it's very interesting that if you look at those 5 bullet points, there's no explicit discussion about release of political prisoners. Who are they going to have the dialogue with if they don't actually set out in a very clear, time-limited way that they're going to do some of these things? I mean, it looks in some ways like you're buying time for the military junta here to continue the ongoing conflict. I hope I'm wrong, but, that is a big glaring hole in the discussions here. And, there's something in the statement that says, well, that some opinions were raised about releasing political prisoners, but quite clearly, if it didn't make it into the consensus point, there is not a consensus on that issue.
Amitav in Washington, what do you think the conversation was, or how did the conversation go between ASEAN ministers and the Myanmar military? Did the military go to these discussions prepared to do this anyway? Because the choreography of these things is such, it always usually is anyway, that the military must have had an idea what ASEAN was going to be going for.
One thing we don't know is what happened before this meeting. And, I was expecting that there would be some backroom prior kind of conversation or some sort of a contact so that this meeting can be most productive. So I think we will not know that full story for some time, but I think ASEAN was under a lot of pressure to do something, and this kind of, in a sense, gives it a little bit of time to tell the international community that ASEAN is not silent. However, let me just make 2 very quick, important points. A lot of damage has been done to ASEAN's reputation. A lot of people have died already. And, so that could have been prevented had ASEAN acted earlier. Second, and even more important, this is not an ASEAN versus West sort of thing. It is actually between people of Myanmar and people of and the military government. And so we should, until and unless people stop dying, the bombings of the minority areas stop, and also political prisoners are released, this conversation is good, but it's not going to convince anybody until actual results are delivered.
Phil Robertson in Bangkok, talking about what the meeting has come up with or not. Would the meeting have been more productive in terms of the optics, perhaps, if there had in effect been 2 chairs at the table, one for the Myanmar military, but also another chair for a representative of the civilian elected government?
Well, I think that is something that we and others were certainly calling for, that you have representatives of the people, because, this civil disobedience movement is really nationwide. It is quite clear that there is very little popular support for the military in Myanmar. And so having a representative of the people that would be there in a position to raise concerns, I think certainly would have been a better look for ASEAN. Our major concern at this point right now is that we're just not going to see effective implementation of many of these provisions. I'm obviously hoping for the best, but I think we also have to prepare for the worst. And it's very clear to me that the international community should not let up on the effort to target both the military and military companies with targeted economic sanctions and continue to put the pressure on. It is really very important that the military feel that they do not have a choice but to go forward with a significant negotiation that will ultimately result in them stepping back and allowing the elected government to take power.
Evan in Jakarta, is part of the pressure that Amitav is talking about, the internal pressure on ASEAN to be seen to be doing something here, a reality of economics, I guess, more than anything else? Because all those ASEAN ministers, surely they do not want to be laying themselves open to accusations of, look, this has tipped into being a failed state. So in that regard, ASEAN's got to kind of go against its central character because it has teeth, but it chooses not to bite anyone?
I think it is certainly the case that this is an unprecedented situation, that we go out of the normal ASEAN calendar year. In fact, the Indonesian President Joko Widodo himself personally called for the ASEAN special meeting, even though he's not the chair, bearing in mind that the current chair is Brunei. And since he made that call, and in fact, before that, Indonesia and others have been negotiating what's the best way, what kind of ASEAN package can we hope to deliver, first and foremost, to end the violence before there's a potential framework for dialogue process. So this, I think, goes back to your earlier point about, is it necessary to have the representation from the National Unity Government? I think I just want to highlight that a part of the conversation between senior officials as well as the foreign ministers yesterday before the summit is the fact that right now, the key immediate task is at hand. The one thing that we must achieve is to end the violence. And if that's the case, then we are not a meeting at the ASEAN Secretariat today to negotiate some sort of settlement, because that is eventually up to an inclusive dialogue process that hopefully can start after we end the violence. And because the goal is to end the violence, we call the one party that we feel is doing most of the violence, which is the military. So this is not in any way about who is legitimately representing Myanmar. Again, this is a question that only the people of Myanmar can decide. What we hope to do is that this framework becomes something that we can build on, and that hopefully we can deliver those commitments, and of course with the help of the international community as well.
Amitav in Washington, clearly we can't speculate as to what the broader plan is on the part of ASEAN, but can you speculate for me what perhaps the broader plan is on the part of the military in Naypyidaw?
Yeah, just to go back to your point about having representation from the National Unity Government, I actually have been arguing for some time, for the last few days, if not weeks, is that ASEAN should first send a mission to Myanmar before having any summit outside of Myanmar. And if you had sent a mission, that mission should have met with the military as well as Aung San Suu Kyi and NLD, or National Unity Government. That would have been easier to meet both sides and also have immediate pressure to stop the violence. So I think that should have been done. First, a mission, and there is precedent for this. And also, I would like to also remind people that in 1997, ASEAN moved away from non-intervention, postponed Cambodia's accession to ASEAN because there was a military coup in Cambodia, by the current leader Hun Sen. So ASEAN actually acted in violation of its traditional non-intervention principles. So there was a precedent for ASEAN to actually do something right there and send a mission before having this summit. Now what happens is, it's hard to tell, because I think, contrary to what people say, I think the military does claim legitimacy. The military coup leader does claim some legitimacy because it was invited and given a seat at the table as an equal to other ASEAN members. So the optics is already there. But I'm not criticizing this summit. I think it's very important to do something. It's better than doing nothing. But I think only time will tell how ASEAN goes about implementing or insisting on all these expectations and demands that the international community and the people of Myanmar have, like stop the killing. Okay. But also the most critical thing is what to do about the election.
Phil, coming back to you for a second, talking about the issue of human rights. Amnesty wants ASEAN to investigate allegations of crimes against humanity. Is it your sense from where you are that ASEAN will kind of sidestep that as a desire, or want to just put it on the back burner?
Well, I think it's a cold day in hell that ASEAN's going to investigate a human rights issue in one of their member states. The reality is that they don't want to touch that. But I think the big issue here is where we're going and what the strategy is of the military. And my view of this right now is this current sort of unclear timeline connected to these 5 points, I think has really allowed the Myanmar military to buy a lot of time. They can say that, we're going to have this mission of the envoy. We're going to have a humanitarian dialogue. We're going to discuss, with various different people about the next steps. It's sort of an open-ended discussion where you could, in fact, see that this would be dragging out over the period of a year when, you're looking at a tug of war that is going on between the military, which is trying to crush the CDM by force, and the CDM, which is trying to strangle the military with a mass strike. And I'm afraid that time may not be on the side of the CDM, and that the military may be playing a long game, using this dialogue process as a cynical way to get the upper hand.
Evan Laxma in Jakarta, just slingshotting back to a point you made a couple of minutes ago, talking about continuing international pressure. There have been ramped up sanctions on the part of the European Union and also the United States, which it would appear have achieved very little on the one hand. On the other hand, the Chinese seem to be emerging here as a conduit for conversation. They were talking to 4 strong, big regional players in the run-up to today's discussions. But the Chinese are talking about, and I quote, a soft landing. I mean, to my ear, that sounds cleverly vague. I don't even know what that means.
Yes, I think, to be honest, I also don't know what that means. But I do think that from earlier on, since February, we already know that sanctions alone will not work. We've done this so many times, but we also know that regional countries like China, Russia, Japan, India, Singapore, Thailand, these are countries with real investment and leverage over Myanmar. Whether in terms of economic or personal relationship or security ties, I think these are the countries that can have actual leverage over Myanmar. So the key isn't so much the types of sanctions, but it's who will be able to use what kind of leverage they have to get the ball rolling. And going back to Phil's point, I fully agree that the timeline thing is a very key point, because when we discuss these ideas that are now encapsulated in the 5 consensus, we haven't really quite figured out the sequence of things. Obviously, we cannot just trust that the commitment will be delivered. We need to find mechanisms to make sure that we can verify those sequences. Do we have aid first and then dialogue? Do we end the violence first and then aid? These are the sequencing of the 5 consensus that I think we have to work out. And I certainly welcome the help of everyone to figure out the best mechanics to do this.
Amitav Acharya in Washington. When the military leadership returns to Napier Door, for them, is the starting point now that they've got to, in effect, maintain what is the new status quo, or has been the status quo since February the 1st? Because they must feel, surely the military in Myanmar knows full well it cannot allow the country now to descend into warring factions. But equally, if that were to happen, it can't allow it to go too far down that road.
Well, my sense is that the military will take back the message. The senior general will take back the message back to Yangon. They will, Naypyidaw, and they will do some adjustments. But honestly, I think they will also. They have already got some time. They will try to buy time, and they will not. The key is they might stop the violence, although there will be excuses that, there's demonstrations and instability, you have to move in, and in that process, more people might die, and they'll continue their attacks on the minorities. I don't think that's going to stop. But the key issue is they are not going to, in my view, come to terms with the legitimately elected government of Myanmar about how to hand over power. And that's going to be a sticking point, and that might drag on for some time. So I don't I don't have a lot of hope on that front.
Phil, on that idea of handling more power, is China pivotal here? Because they, slightly apart from other regional administrations, regional prime ministers and presidents, they seem to be signaling, we realize this could not only end up with a failed state, it could also destabilize the entire region. Well,
I think China does have a very key role to play. And they also recognize that their China-Myanmar economic corridor, which is part of their Belt and Road Initiative, is potentially at risk if this instability continues. So they have a strong self-interest in trying to stabilize the situation. And I expect China may try to work behind the scenes with some of the ASEAN governments that are trying to move this forward, like Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore. It's very possible that we will see China playing that behind-the-scenes role. But at the same time, China is also playing a very negative role in preventing any action going forward at the UN Security Council. And one of the, for instance, biggest points of leverage that we could see would be if there was a global arms embargo against the Myanmar military and police. And that is being held up by China and also by Russia. So, China's really playing a double game here. They're on one hand defending the military regime, but on the other hand saying that they're open to trying to figure out a solution. And we just don't know how this is going to play out. I think that it's very possible that also if China decides to start doing things that the Myanmar military doesn't like, the Myanmar military can also turn to Russia and say, you guys have to help us out blocking things at the international community. And I think Russia would be prepared to play that role.
Evan, if what we're talking about today, at the centre of our discussion, these 5 points that they've come up with, if that is really genuinely progress, how will it go down with the protesters? Because their takeaway, whenever one talks to anyone involved in the protest movement there, they basically always say the same thing. They say, look, we've got nothing to lose. That's our starting point. So why shouldn't we keep on protesting?
Yes, I fully agree. I think the key measurement of success of those 5 key points would be to what extent things on the ground change. Right now, what we have are progress on the commitment side and the policy rhetoric side, but we need to see actual implementation of those key points. And we hope that one of the key points that is put there, which is the ending of violence, that hopefully would be the first a benchmark to assess whether or not those 5 key points can actually deliver progress. But absolutely, we cannot claim any kind of success if the violence continues and if the nationwide protests keep going and the violence continue. I don't think there's any way to claim the 5-point consensus is a success. So the first benchmark for me is not the ASEAN special envoy. It's not the humanitarian aid, but it's to what extent can we actually end the violence against civilian protesters.
Amitav Acharya in Washington. Very, very briefly, Amitav, we're heading towards the end of the programme. If these 5 points represent potentially the beginning of step change, for you, what are the chances that the military will now, at some point in the next week or a month perhaps, say, look, actually, we do recognise the results of the election?
Well, if the military recognizes the results of the election and says that in some sort of a statement that is also ASEAN also accepts that, that will be real progress. But how this is implemented is going to be the real issue. Is ASEAN going to keep following up and pursuing this agenda, sending missions, having this dialogue? If ASEAN does that, that will be good. But a very quick final point, the term failed state is not the right word to use here. This country has been in isolation for decades before the opening up, and they know what it means to be isolated and to be under sanctions. So the idea of a failed state to me is a totally misnomer here. They can take this, and they will have allies like China.
Phil in Bangkok, super briefly, please. You were grinning then when I was saying about the military accepting the election result. Maybe we should flip over to the Weather Channel and see if hell has frozen over. What are the chances that that might happen?
Well, I mean, I think that one of the major reasons that this coup took place is Min Aung Hlaing and the military realized they could never win election as long as Aung San Suu Kyi and the National League for Democracy are running. And part of the reason they've talked to the Thai prime minister in the past is because he's been successful at getting rid of troublesome political parties that are very popular in Thailand. So I expect that it's going to be very, very difficult for them to move forward with that kind of real change where they do, in fact, recognize that the November 2020 election was legitimate.
Gentlemen, we have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us here on Inside Story. Thanks to our guests. They were Amitav Acharya, Phil Robertson and Evan Laxmana. And thank you too for your company. You can see the show again anytime via the website aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. We're at AJ Inside Story. From me, Peter Dobby, and the entire team here in Doha, thanks for watching. I will see you very soon. For the moment, bye-bye.